Everyone has beliefs and things that they have learned throughout their life. However, sometimes those things turn out not to be true or actually the case. Throughout taking this course, there are 5 things that I had previously believed that now I know differently. Starting off with, we have about divided attention, or being able to do one task while also doing another. For example, talking on the phone while driving your car. Personally, I've always been a person who tries to do as many things as possible at once. While listening to a lecture, I very much am guilty of doing other things, including playing card games like solitaire, because I didn't realize how detrimental that could really be. In a study mentioned in Glenn 2010's article, there was a test done with both people who identified themselves as multitaskers and those who preferred to focus on just one task at a time. This was a cognition and memory task that had involved a lot of distractions. Those who self-identified as multitaskers did worse on these tests than those who preferred to focus on just one task at a time. This is probably because people who view themselves as multitaskers are more likely to give in to distractions because they don't realize just how detrimental giving into distractions can really be, whereas those who prefer to focus on one task at the same time are more used to getting rid of those distractions or putting them off or ignoring them because they know, or at least understand to some capacity, that giving into those distractions will severely hurt their performance and that they need to continue to focus on what they're doing, focus on the test or task at hand, in order to receive the best possible outcome. Also cited in the Glenn 2010 article was about a professor who didn't like having his students take notes in class. He said he would provide the materials in a series of other ways, but this included students not having access to technology or paper and pencil notes in class, for reasons that trying to pay attention to the lecture and write notes can actually interfere with your ability to fully hear and understand the lecture. As an exercise, he conducted with his class an exercise that basically, the first thing he did was ask them to say letters A through J in order as fast as they could. It took them about 2 seconds. He then asked them to do the same but with numbers 1 through 10, which also took them about 2 seconds. Thirdly, he asked them to alternate between the two, like A1, B2, C3, etc., etc. Of course, you may think that this would take 4 seconds, as saying the letters was 2 and the numbers was 2. However, because our brains take a little bit of lag to switch between the two tasks, it actually took the class members about 15 to 20 seconds. And even some had error during those 15 to 20 seconds, because switching between doing different tasks has a bit of mental lag, which can reduce performance. All in all, oftentimes we'll overestimate our ability to pay attention to 2 different things at once, despite the fact that is not actually the best way to receive information and can hurt both tasks that we're doing. So listening to a lecture while playing solitaire isn't the best way to get the lecture information. The next thing that I had to unlearn was that not all adolescents reach Piaget's formal operation stage. Well, while in Psychology 101 and earlier in this class, I had assumed that even though some of Piaget's thinking wasn't completely correct or was a little off base, that at least the basic requirements for each stage would be met once people achieved that age group or were at least remotely close to the age range it was supposed to be. That's not actually the case, though. An article by Kuhn in 2008 talks about some of the criticisms of Piaget's theory and talks about how not everyone actually reaches this stage. Some people can reason on formal operations to some degree, but don't use it in every time they need to reason for something. They'll use it selectively or for certain arguments. Sometimes they'll think really logically or scientifically, but not all times. In fact, most people don't actually use it the majority of the time. For example, have you ever argued with someone except for they don't really seem to be taking the argument at a very logical approach? Their arguments are going in circles and they just seem angry, but they're not actually getting pretty much any information across. They're just being mad and refusing to listen to you. Yeah, me too. These would be examples of people who are not demonstrating Piaget's formal operations. All in all, not everyone reaches this stage, and sometimes people can fluctuate between going back and forth. Yes, we do think differently than we did when we were 12, but sometimes that scientific thinking just doesn't quite carry through. The next topic is unfortunately a much darker one, and that's self-injury in some correlation to suicide rates. I had always thought that the amount of people who actually hurt themselves or on purpose was fairly low, and that most people who did so had such negative attitudes that it was in some form of attempt, or at least those who did were very much more likely to attempt. This is not quite as I had thought. An article by Sorenberger et al. Included a statistic that stated that between 14 and 24% of all adolescents reported non-suicidal self-injury or NSSI at least once in their life. They decided to do a study, and that study showed that 26.1% of the sample group reported doing NSSI. In the study, 2/3 of those who reported self-injury were women. Elsewhere in the article, they reported that those who engaged in non-suicidal self-injury more frequently and used more methods had a higher chance of actually going further and attempting suicide. Those who only engaged in one or so methods were less likely to actually make an attempt on their own life. A textbook written by Belsky in 2019 states that 18 out of 100,000 teens actually succeed in committing suicide. So while this is still a major problem, it isn't as big of a problem as I had previously thought. And the numbers between the people who attempt suicide and attempt non-suicidal self-injury is a much bigger gap than I had previously thought. NSSI is a huge, huge issue. On a lighter note, I'm going to talk about sympathy, empathy, and how they both relate to being pro-social. I had always been told that empathy was the value you wanted to have. Empathy was more important than sympathy. Empathy was more valued than sympathy, as empathy demonstrated a deeper connection. However, in the textbook previously mentioned, written by Belsky in 2019, they mentioned that sympathy is actually the more pro-social behavior. Take this example that was mentioned. Some poor unfortunate child spills their lunch tray in front of the entire cafeteria. People are laughing about them in the distance. Person A reacts with empathy and experiences secondhand embarrassment for them. Person B feels bad for the person and is more likely to take action like helping them clean up or pick up some of the things that dropped from their tray, and thus is the more pro-social option, as empathy doesn't necessarily result in action and sometimes can have a reaction that is too strong to be pro-social. Now, of course, this is not to say that empathy is not good, as a lot of times empathy can help connect with another person on a deeper level. It's not that empathy doesn't have any pro-social qualities, just that it didn't have as much as I thought it was, and that reacting in sympathy was reacting in the more pro-social way because it allows them to not only feel towards the injured party, but it also allows them to act upon it in some capacities or some senses. The final topic I had to unlearn was about aggression. I had previously believed that boys were just more aggressive than girls were. An article by Bowie in 2007, it showed that it's not necessarily that boys are more aggressive, just that they manifest this aggression in different ways. Boys are more likely to be more physically aggressive, like starting fights or throwing punches or things like that, whereas girls don't typically engage in that kind of aggression. Of course, there are some that definitely do. However, that's not girls' primary way of aggression. And since that's been my primary way of thinking about aggression, as well as a number of other people out there, girls are just generally viewed as being less aggressive. Girls, however, typically use indirect or relational aggression towards other people. They sabotage and manipulate from the background without overtly confronting someone or hitting someone or throwing a punch. In Bowie's article, a study done by Coyne and Archer in 2005 that was conducted showed that girls who had seen relational aggression portrayed on TV and other forms of media were more apt to display relational aggression. Overall, it's not that boys are necessarily more aggressive than girls, just that they exhibit their aggression differently. Girls are more relationally aggressive, and this relational aggression can be fueled by TV and media and movies and other such things that teach them that it's not only okay to be relationally aggressive, but it's also socially acceptable. Now, these are 5 things that I believed one way but had to completely change because they weren't necessarily what was correct. Sometimes it can be really hard to confront beliefs that aren't necessarily true. We like to confirm our own bias or find the evidence that picks out and supports what we believe. And sometimes it can be hard to deal with realizing that we aren't always right, especially when we're directly confronted evidence that proves that we're wrong. But it's still important. And it's still something that we'll have to do over and over and over again. Honestly, the biggest thing that helped me was just looking at the research, looking at the numbers, looking at the statistics, and going and being open with myself and realizing I am capable of being wrong. Not everything I believe is correct, and that it's okay to admit that you're wrong sometimes. And you can grow and learn from that. That it's good, and the best way to do it is have an open mind, especially when learning new information. Perhaps be skeptical at the start, so that if that information is challenged, that you can build up those beliefs and they can become stronger and more factually sourced. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, despite the fact that there have been so many little editing difficulties. I apologize for that and my awkwardness on camera, but take care.